All right, guys, here we go with the team-based learning day for section 4 of the class. We're going to be talking about the shoulder muscles, so that includes muscles of the shoulder girdle that act on the scapula, intrinsic shoulder muscles, which act on the glenohumeral joint, and then we'll also be talking about the muscles of the brachium, which is the upper arm. So here we go. Okay, so this is just a quick review on the shoulder girdle. You guys are familiar with the bones that make up the shoulder girdle and the shoulder joint complex. So I'm not going to go over this. This shows the bones that make up the shoulder joint complex as well as the different bony articulations or the joints. Okay. All right, so this is an overview of the muscles of the shoulder girdle that we're going to look at. And I'm going to go through this stuff quickly because I know you can pause the video and write stuff down. Okay, so we're going to be looking at these muscles here. So we'll start on the anterior side over here. So number one, as you guys know, most likely is the pectoralis major. But before we do that, the nerve that innervates all of these muscles, we're just going to call it the brachial plexus. Okay, so that's a grouping of a bunch of nerves coming out of the cervical vertebrae. But there are some specific nerve names that we're not going to go into in this class, but for all of the anterior and posterior shoulder girdle muscles that you see here, you can use the brachial plexus as their innervation point. Okay? All right, so number one is pectoralis major. Number two, you can only see it on this side because it's underneath pectoralis major, but that's pectoralis minor. Okay, number three is going to be on the side, on either side, and that's the serratus anterior. So that's over here. We're going to look at that muscle a little bit more. And then we have the number four, which is the trapezius muscle. It's a large muscle with three distinct portions that have different actions. So trapezius is there. Number five is the rhomboids. So the rhomboids are underneath the trapezius, and so you can't see them unless the trapezius muscle is removed. Okay, latissimus dorsi is shown here. Number six, this large muscle comes around the back and has a very broad origination and a very distinct insertion point on the humerus. And number seven is the levator scapulae. That's this one here. It's going up almost more of a neck muscle, but it acts on the scapula. So let's take. So one thing I want to make sure is clear before we move any further on these muscles that act on the scapula is the two scapular movements that are kind of tricky to understand. So this first one on the left here, this one here, so you can see the scapula moving up this way, so up this way, okay? So that one is actually called upward rotation of the scapula. So this would be the same motion that happens when you do this with your shoulders. When you lift your shoulders up, or you abduct or abduct your shoulders, your scapula must upwardly rotate in order to accommodate for that movement. Okay, and then it's just the opposite with this one, downward rotation. When you adduct your shoulder, your scapula must downwardly rotate in order to keep the humerus in line with the scapula here. Okay, so those are the two scapular movements, and then two other scapular movements that are important that I don't have pictures of here are scapular retraction and scapular protraction. So retracting your scapulae is the same as kind of like a rowing motion. So if you're doing a rowing machine, a rowing ergometer at the gym, where you have your hands out in front of you together, and you pull back and pinch your scapula together, kind of pinch your shoulder blades together, that's scapular retraction. And then the opposite, scapular protraction, is what you do when you do a bench press. You're pushing your hands forward, your scapula have to kind of roll forwards around your back. So those are two special movements, scapula. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because you have all the notes here and there's not a lot to talk about. A lot of it's just memorization, but I will point out the kind of key components of each muscle here. Okay, so latissimus dorsi, like I said, it's a very broad origination all the way from T7 down to L5. So you can see that huge origination point. It comes around, and the key thing is it wraps around the front of the humerus and actually attaches on the anterior side of the humerus. And the fact that it goes around the humerus on the medial side is what makes it an internal rotator. Okay, so on the next page with its actions, it's a shoulder internal rotator. Scapular depressor. So scapular depression is the scapula moving straight downwards, and so that's what that is. Shoulder adduction. It's a shoulder adductor, and it's also a shoulder extensor. Okay, so activities we think of when we think about the lats or the latissimus dorsi, doing pull-ups like this, doing rowing type of activities, those type of activities are the lats, latissimus dorsi, are very important. Okay, levator scapulae. This is a smaller muscle, but as you can see, it starts on the cervical vertebrae, the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae, comes down and attaches to that medial border of the scapula. And so what this does is this elevates the scapula, just like its name. Levator scapulae means it's elevating the scapula. And then it's also a downward rotator of the scapula. Okay, so remember, downward rotation means that if the tip of the scapula was up here, it's moving down like this. So because of this angle of pull, it kind of twists the scapula downwards when it moves. And so if the scapula is fixed, the other action you see here is side flexion of the neck. So you could, if the scapula doesn't move and this muscle contracts, the head would go this way, right? And you would kind of like taking your ear towards your shoulder. Okay. Next one is the rhomboids, and the rhomboids are called that because they're shaped. This is the shape of a rhomboid down here, and so this muscle is shaped like a rhomboid, just kind of rotated. Right. So these are major scapular retractors. Okay. So these are what help us to pinch the shoulder blades together, and they also help us to downwardly rotate the scapula because of this angle. When they contract the scapula, the bottom of the scapula, that inferior angle is going to go down towards the spine, which is downward rotation. These muscles keeping these muscles strong are important for scapular stabilization and avoiding kyphosis. Kyphosis is when you have your shoulders rolled forward and your head kind of downwards, like people do when they spend too much time on the computer, and those muscles get kind of stretched out. So you can kind of strengthen these muscles to pull your scapula back and get you back up into better posture. Okay, trapezius muscles. These are very large muscles, large origination point all the way from the occipital bone all the way down to T12. So it covers your whole cervical and thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and then the insertion point is all around the scapula, acromion, scapula, and then even part of the clavicle for the upper trapezius. So this is called trapezius because they're shaped like a trapezoid. Okay, and each side is shaped like a trapezoid. That's how it works. The longer side of the trapezoid is here along the spine, and the flatter, shorter side is over here on the lateral part of the body. So the trapezius muscle has three distinct sections: upper trapezius, middle trapezius, and lower trapezius. So the upper fibers are there for elevating the scapula, which is like doing shoulder shrugs. Those would be like that's scapular elevation. Middle fibers are retractors. They pull the scapula back, pinching those scapula together. And lower fibers are scapular depressors. Okay, and then they can also have actions on the head if the scapula is not moving. So that would be extension of the neck, so pulling your head back, like lifting your chin up. And then side flexions would be taking your ear over and touching your shoulder, straight over. That's side flexion of the neck. These are the most common muscles to have spasms in and trigger points, and those are shown here. And those can lead to headaches and migraines and all kinds of things like that. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys summarize these muscles here on your own. You're just doing it by origin, by insertion, and by actions they have on the scapula. So I'm going to leave that for you to fill out. Okay, on the anterior side, now we have, starting with the anterior, we have the pectoralis major muscle, which is you guys know this muscle. It's the pec. It originates all along here from the clavicle, sternum, all the way down to some of the cartilage on the ribs here, and then it inserts on the anterior side of the humerus, intertubercular groove. So it's between the tubercles of the humerus. Okay, so the main actions are shoulder flexion, shoulder adduction, and shoulder internal rotation. So the exercises you think of when you think of pecs are most likely a bench press. Okay, bench press is going to be mainly shoulder adduction, right? Adduction, with a little bit of shoulder flexion. Also, like fly exercises, we're doing a bench press with like a dumbbell press with a dumbbell in each hand and getting lots of shoulder extension happening first, or abduction, and then pulling back into adduction. Pectoralis minor muscle. This is more of a scapular muscle. It does not attach to the humerus. It comes from the 3, 4, and 5 ribs and goes up and attaches to the coracoid process of the scapula. Okay, so the actions are: 1, if the scapula is not moving, then it'll actually help to lift up the rib cage, and that can help with taking a deep breath in. But if the scapula moves and the rib cage is stable, then what happens to the scapula is actually downward rotation. Okay, so that one you'll have to think about, and think about the angle of pull it has on the scapula and how that would be a downward rotator of the scapula. Okay, and then we have probably a less known muscle called the serratus anterior, and what the serratus anterior does, it originates on the anterior lateral side of the ribs, and then it comes back and attaches to the scapula, the anterior surface of the medial side of the scapula. Okay, so a big job of this guy is to hold the scapula against the thorax. Okay, so these contract and pulls the scapula down. Okay, it also is responsible for scapular protraction. So when you're doing a bench press and that scapula needs to move forward, as your arms move forward, the serratus anterior muscles are helping to move the scapula forward. It's also very important for punching. So if you do a nice hard punch straight out in front of your body, your serratus anterior muscles are important for that. So very, very important for boxers and athletes that are punching like that. And then winging of the scapula. This is shown here when the scapula actually pops off the back, and this can happen because of an impingement of the nerve that it's called the long thoracic nerve that innervates this serratus anterior muscle. If that's not activating properly and it doesn't let the serratus anterior activate properly, when you're pushing against a wall like this person is, and your scapula will kind of pop off your back. That shows the importance of those muscles in holding the scapula down. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys again summarize these muscles here, doing it again by origin, insertion, actions they have on the scapula, and then for the pectoralis major you can kind of think about which actions that muscle has on the shoulder, on the glenohumeral joint. Okay, so let's move into the intrinsic muscles of the shoulder. Okay, so again, for the nerve that innervates these, we're going to just say that the brachial plexus is the main nerve that's going to innervate all of these. Okay, that is a simplification, but that should be a little bit easier for you to remember than knowing the exact nerve. Okay, so this is showing the rotator cuff muscles. So A, B, and C there. A is the subscapularis, so this is the only one that's on the anterior side of the scapula. Supraspinatus, either you can say it either way, is above the spine of the scapula. This is now the posterior view, and then infraspinatus is below the spine of the scapula, and then with D is the teres minor. It's just below the infraspinatus. Okay, you can see it from the posterior view or the anterior view. And then also the deltoid muscle we'll look at. It's not really an intrinsic muscle, but it's a large shoulder mover. Okay, so let's look at the deltoid first. The deltoid is a large muscle, triangle-shaped, and it originates up on the clavicle on the acromion, and then all comes down to the deltoid tuberosity along the humerus. Okay, so you have kind of three different sections of the deltoid, just like you do with the trapezius. So the anterior fibers are going to be important for shoulder flexion, lateral for abduction, and posterior for shoulder extension. Okay, the application to injections this is the most common site for injections because you have a nice big muscle belly there, and they can put the needle right into that muscle belly, and you know it's going to stay in muscle and not hit a nerve or a bone or something else that could cause damage or be more painful. Okay, so these rotator cuff muscles, as we've talked about, the functions of these muscles are 1, to stabilize the shoulder, 2, to decelerate the throwing motion, so that they're kind of your brakes for throwing. And then most of them are external rotators, but we're going to talk about one that's an internal rotator, and then one that's mostly a pure abductor. Okay, so the way you can look at this, this is just kind of showing where they all lie, and you can see their insertion points. Okay, so the way you can look at this, if we're looking at a lateral view of the humerus down here on the right, and this one here that has kind of an anterior insertion, that's where the subscapularis inserts. Right here directly on top of the humerus, right in the middle, is the supraspinatus muscle, and then just posterior to that is infraspinatus. Just posterior to that is teres minor. Okay, so this question here is asking about the rotator cuff muscles. Which of the rotator cuff muscles is an internal rotator? There's only one, so I'm going to let you guys answer that question as we go through. Okay, so supraspinatus, as I said, it lies above the spine of the scapula. That's what it's called, supraspinatus. Okay, and it comes and attaches right on top of the humerus, so that makes it an abductor. It's an abductor. Okay, it also prevents inferior dislocation and also stabilizes the shoulder. This one is very common to be pinched between the humerus and the acromion process, and in a syndrome that's called impingement syndrome. It's a painful syndrome that a lot of throwing athletes or overhead athletes get. Next one is infraspinatus. As I mentioned before, it lies just below the spine of the scapula, and this one is actually an external rotator as well as also stabilizes the shoulder. Teres minor, again, because of its location, because how it attaches towards the posterior side of the humerus, it's an external rotator, and it's going to lie just below infraspinatus, and it's also important for stabilization, like all the rotator cuff muscles are. Okay, and then we've got subscapularis, which is the only one that's on the anterior side of the scapula, and it comes up and attaches right on the anterior side of the humerus, so you can picture this one shortening. This one would be an internal rotator, right? So this is the only one of the rotator cuff muscles that's an internal rotator, but they all are involved in stabilization. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys do this recap here, and you can put that information together, and that hopefully will help you remember the shoulder muscles. Okay, and finally we're going to end with the brachium muscle. So the brachium is pretty much considered the upper arm. So number one here is the lateral head of the triceps. Okay, and so the triceps have three different heads. You need to know the three different heads. So the lateral head. Number two is the long head. Three is the medial head. Okay, number 4 and 5 are the two heads of the biceps brachii. So again, triceps, you'll need to say triceps brachii. For biceps, you'll need to say biceps brachii. So for the number 4, it's the long head of the biceps. That's always going to be more lateral. Whereas the short head, number 5, is the more medial one. Okay, and then number 6 is a less commonly known muscle called the brachialis. It's a very important muscle for elbow flexion. And then number 7 is brachioradialis, which is kind of halfway between the upper arm and the lower arm. Okay, so this question is one that you might not have thought of. Everybody thinks that the biceps brachii is the strongest elbow flexor, but actually the strongest elbow flexor is typically considered to be the brachialis muscle, which is kind of hidden under the biceps brachii, and we don't give it much credit, but it's actually a very important elbow flexor muscle. Triceps brachii is innervated by the radial nerve. Okay, it has 3 different origins because there's 3 different heads, but they all insert somewhere around the olecranon fossa. Okay, so that's down on the ulna. Right, so these are all elbow extensors, but the long head is also a shoulder extensor, and we'll show you why here in a sec. So you can see the 3 different heads. So here's the lateral head, it's on the lateral side. Long head actually goes up and crosses over the shoulder joint. That's what makes it a shoulder extensor as well as an elbow extensor. And then all of them come down here and attach to the olecranon process there. Okay, and then you can see the medial head is actually underneath the 2 more superficial heads, and that's shown right here. So you can see the only one that actually crosses the shoulder joint is the long head. So that's the only one that has an action on both the shoulder and the elbow. Okay, biceps brachii. You can see the long head, as we've talked about, goes up through between the 2 tubercles of the humerus and goes and attaches to the top of the acromion. That's why it's so important for shoulder stabilization. And then the short head comes up and attaches to that the process there. What is that process called? Coracoid process. Thank you. I was forgetting it for a second. Coracoid process attaches right there. So this muscle is very important for elbow flexion, but also supination. Okay, so think about this insertion point. The biceps brachii comes down here and attaches on the radius, and when it does that, if you're already in pronation, it contracts and pulls this radius up, which would cause you to go into supination. Okay, brachialis muscle. So as I said, the brachialis is hidden underneath the biceps brachii, but it's a large muscle that crosses the elbow joint. So it's very important for elbow flexion. Okay, brachioradialis is a longer, thinner muscle, but it starts on the humerus, goes all the way down, attaches way down towards the distal side of the radius. Okay, and that's also a very important elbow flexor. So before we move on, I'm going to let you do most of this recap on your own. But the one I'm going to walk through with you here is this how to target each elbow flexor. So the biceps brachii, you target by having your so what you're going to do is do elbow curls as you're sitting here listening. Okay, so you're going to do an elbow curl and resist your own elbow curl by pushing your hand down. Okay, so pushing your right hand down with your left hand and not allowing your right hand to do the curl. Okay, so if you have your palm facing upwards, that's going to be mainly targeting the biceps brachii. Then go ahead and rotate your hand up. Go into a little bit of pronation, so your thumb is facing upwards, and then push up again. You'll see the muscle pop up on your forearm. That's your brachioradialis muscle. Okay, so that's going to be really targeting your brachioradialis when your thumb's up. And then if you go all the way over into pronation and do the same thing, so you'll be pushing on the back of your hand, the posterior side of your hand now, and again doing that elbow flexion. That one's really going to be pushing up and using the brachialis muscle. Okay, so we can review that. We'll definitely review that again on Monday, but that's something for you to play around with and try out.